Welcome to episode 13 of Building Blocks with Brendan. Today we connect with Kenny over at Kicksaw to learn how he started his business in Salesforce consulting, but also learning his whole approach to entrepreneurship, which is very refreshing to what you would typically see online. What's really interesting about Kenny is that actually both of us have very similar backgrounds. We both went to Laurier, we're a similar year, and both took part in unpaid internships during our time through undergrad. Unpaid internships are something that is heavily debated. Are they beneficial to an organization? Are they beneficial to an individual? Are they predatory? But what's really interesting is that both our views were very similar. During this podcast, we go over some of the benefits of unpaid internships and internships in general, but also some of the risks and some of the issues that when you're young, you might not be fully aware of. One of the big things about unpaid internships that I found interesting throughout my career is that the unpaid portion actually hurts the company more than the individual a lot of the times. And that is due to the fact that when there is no monetary, no money on the line and there's no contract, employers have a hard time relying on an individual to get work done, especially in tight deadlines. So for most organizations, it's actually beneficial for them to pay a salary, not only for the optics of it, for the positivity of it and actually paying someone for the work, but also to at least have some incentive for an individual to do work. But we go over that and many other things, and really for how with both of us, how the unpaid internship actually helped us progress quite farther in our career by viewing it more as a secondary course or another course within business. We both were doing really around sales, so you could call it Sales 101. Although instead of getting credits, you really just got more work experience with hopes of getting an internship down the line or getting a paid job down the line. Although for me, and I think for a lot of people, you have to realize, especially when it comes to these type of arrangements, you can never plan on a job. Until a contract is signed, really anything's up in the air. And that is a hard lesson I learned throughout my career. What's also very interesting about Kenny is that how he approaches entrepreneurship. One thing he says within the podcast is, you don't have to start a business to start something. And although that may sound simple or something you'd say, well, that makes sense. I could just do anything. Why do I have to start a business? It's that for a lot of individuals, when it comes to entrepreneurship, they think they need to create a unicorn. They have to have $1 billion idea. They need to raise $1 million in funding. But a lot of the times what you learn being an entrepreneur, running a startup, is that a lot of the skills and some of the skills actually make individuals successful for later businesses or later conversations or later projects they have is the ability to manage people and manage relationships and manage timelines. And you can get a lot of these skills by doing other things that don't require a business. So for example, Kenny starts, SalesTO or sales meetup. And this taught him, and he goes over how this really taught him how to start a business, how to create a network, how to really go above and beyond and develop a brand. And with these skills, he was able to start his multiple startups he's worked through and been a part of. And I really think that this conversation really opened my eyes a lot more to the idea of expanding what it means to be an entrepreneur, but most importantly, expanding on how you can get the skills to become a successful business individual or to create your own thing. And a lot of times when we speak to other people or speak to anyone who has a side hustle or a side project, a lot of times it doesn't start off as a business, but through time and through effort, you really learn how you can expand anything and to make it a full-time job. Another thing we talked about on this podcast that I found very interesting is how to get most out of a current job. For him, he really looked at any career opportunity as a way of going above and beyond and learning what he wanted to learn. He knew he was very aware of what he didn't like to do, but he wanted to explore more of what he might like or might not like. He wanted to explore what the corporate world had for him. So a lot of times within the sales roles, as you'll hear during this podcast, he'd go above and beyond and try new things. Although his job title only covered X, he'd try to cover Y. He'd see if he can close clients, speak with different clients, work on different sales calls, sales pitches. I think this knowledge is good for anyone to really understand and take advantage of. That the idea is not to do more work for free, but it's to get experience for your next role or to experience new job opportunities you might not be aware of while still having a job and still being able to expand from a single point. For him, he got into sales and was able actually to accelerate faster through his career because he was able to build a sales acumen without really needing to have a direct outbound sales role. And because of his position and where he was, his organization was happy for him to try it out because it cost nothing more to them. And I think when you're looking at a job or working with an employer, it's always really important to see where a trade-off can happen. If it's something that benefits you but doesn't affect them that much, they're more likely to take it. Where if it's a complete trade-off, a lot of times that's where there can be sticking points or friction. Why this is so important in our conversation and during the podcast is really how we got into Salesforce consulting. If you've worked in the corporate world or any B2B, you know how complex Salesforce can be. It's a huge industry, and that's really what Kicksaw operates in. But how he got into the industry was very interesting. I mean, he had to be very humble and realize he had to learn a lot about the software, a lot about himself, but most importantly, he had to take an initiative with his organization to learn it. And by taking that initiative, he was actually able to get some courses paid for by his organization at the time. And then from there, he kept expanding his knowledge, so much so where he was able to become a freelancer. And then while being a freelancer, he was able to start his organization, his business, Kicksaw, while still having a paying job, doing what he was already knew how to do, but doing the exact same thing, except now running it with multiple more people. I think that is a very interesting message you typically don't hear. You typically hear of a startup having to drop everything and take a huge risk. And although that makes a lot of sense for a lot of people, and sometimes it's required, there's other ways of starting a business. A lot of times it's taking a skill you already have and building a business around it. And that's what I think Kenny has done very well and has articulated very well during this episode. Hopefully you guys enjoy. Kenny, thank you so much for connecting. I came across your profile on LinkedIn, and I know right now your toes are in many different things, so you're working on many different things. I guess to start off, what's your story? What's your background, and kind of what are your current things you're working on right now?
Yeah. So we'll kind of start off going as far back as my education. So I went to Laurier for my undergrad. And actually, prior to Laurier, I always found myself just wanting to get exposure to business. I started working doing telemarketing when I was like 14.
Wow.
They wanted me to tell people that I was a girl because my voice at the time on the phone. And then I eventually got a job at Running Room in retail, selling shoes and running classes. And from there, I then went to Laurier. And even at Laurier, I still worked throughout my entire time there. And that's when, in the third year, when I really had to decide which direction I wanted to go down, I was leaning between finance and entrepreneurship. Finance because I was interested in numbers and just how the world worked, and it was a useful skill. Entrepreneurship because I always found myself just interested in creating and just never found I worked at Fidelity for a semester and I never found that I just jived well with finance. It just wasn't my thing. And so like the person I am, I tend to act and think next. And so in my third year, I approached an organization called Vidyard out in KW, and I went to a job fair for engineers. And I said to the CEO, "I'm not an engineer, but I'm in sales and marketing, and I had no previous sales or marketing experience. But are you interested in hiring me?" And he was very tentative, and I persisted enough so that he's like, "Great, come in, talk to kind of the guy who's running sales today, and we'll see." Um, Went there, told him that I'm still in school, in that I'd need a part-time job, and they're like, absolutely no, like we're not interested in hiring students. And so then I convinced them that I would work for free for 3 to 4 months. My own laptop, right? Nowadays in a tech company, they always give you laptops. My own Sony Vaio. They gave me breakfast and lunch, and so I was basically at the office every hour that I wasn't in school, and it was an amazing experience. Day one, I was already cold calling, prospecting people. It was kind of like, look, dude, if you want to figure this out, just like figure it out. We can't train you. We've got like 14 employees. No one cares about you. Either you add value and you figure it out, or this isn't a good fit for you. And so I was thrown into the deep end, and I had to make it work. And it was probably the best experience because you learn you learn a lot on the job, and it forced me to level up my knowledge and study and figure stuff out. And I had an amazing few mentors there that I could just ask a billion questions to.
Mm-hmm.
And similarly to how I do other things, I just kind of do things and then think. And so I just bugged people. I just asked everyone questions. I just
Mm-hmm.
annoyed people. I think people appreciated having um, um, that type of mindset, very curious and just young or nascent mindset in the industry. Anyways, long story short, things went well. I ended up doing my last co-op there, and
Mm-hmm.
then they offered me a full-time gig going into my fourth year. So I moved all my classes
Mm-hmm.
to evening classes and Friday classes, and I ended up working full-time while in school in my fourth year. And so I was learning about accounting and finance and entrepreneurship in school, and then I was actually doing a full-time job in business. And it was really hard to come to terms with why am I in school? I'm making a
Mm-hmm.
good salary. I'm
Mm-hmm.
learning a lot. I'm meeting people in the professional world that have done amazing things. And so it was really tough for me that year because I almost felt like invalidated aspects of school, which is just
Mm-hmm.
like, I don't need to learn this. I'm learning about commissions and finance and
Mm-hmm.
revenue recognition and bookings in real life. And I'm learning about these weird, archaic, obsolete concepts in school. Anyways, that continued with Vidyard after I graduated and started to work there. Continued to work there for another 8 months, and then a funny anecdote. So I got that. I found out about that job through Twitter.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I was on Twitter and I heard of another company called Hired, which was opening up in
Mm-hmm.
Canada, and so I like the type of person I am, decided I don't need to apply for that. I'm going to just reach out to every single person who's involved in bringing Hired to Canada. And so I bombarded them to the point where they finally interviewed me, asked
Mm-hmm.
me to apply. Long story short, I got the job there as the first salesperson in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
And so then I started at Hired. During my time at Hired is when I kicked off SalesTO, and I imagine we'll get into that a little bit
Mm-hmm.
later. And that kind of set forth my career in sales and sales ops.
Yeah, and what's really funny about your story is that kind of similar to me in regards to my first few roles. So when I was at Laurier as well, I don't know if I was taking a course, but I started emailing all the startups at Velocity. Unfortunately, it wasn't Communitech, still Velocity, so still Waterloo's incubator. And I did a very similar thing. So my background wasn't, thought I wanted to be computer, thought I wanted to go to CS before university. Realized computer science is cool, but you don't make video games full time. It's a lot more data driven, a lot more engineering focused than just being creative. So I said, the human mind's kind of interesting. Let me go into business where I get to do some theory based stuff as well as some actual stuff to learn how businesses work. I too liked math and numbers, but for some reason, and it might be a regret to this day, I never took finance courses. Even though I liked math, I just didn't like finance. I didn't care about what finance was doing or people who were in finance. It just didn't mesh with me. I wasn't too interested. I didn't know though the salaries could be so good in finance. So looking back, I was always wondering why didn't I just go more into finance? There's so many cool opportunities there. But like the same thing, entrepreneurship was primarily my focus
Mm-hmm.
just because I found it quite interesting and I thought it would match really what I want to do with my life. I reached out to all these CEOs at Velocity and was able to get an interview and work for free, doing sales and marketing for a team. They were called Metric Wire at the time, of like 5 people. And they were just got into Y Combinator. So I was like helping them with boots on the ground in Canada while they were over in California. And it was a very unique opportunity. I worked there a little bit during third and fourth year as well. But unfortunately, when it came time to graduate, there wasn't the raise, and I learned a lot very quickly how raising money is important. How unless you have a contract, everything is just based on good faith. So I had some strong learning experiences there, but luckily I was able to find another startup at the time working for Bonfire. That
Yeah.
I was like employee number 10. I left employee number
Wow.
20. Now there are like 300 people in KW. So I also interviewed with Vidyard, and I got to talk with the CEO at the time. And funny enough, I've never told this story, but I got sassed the hardest I've ever had in an interview during that time. I was talking to Michael, who's the CEO, and I said, "Oh, I'm interested in entrepreneurship, and I want to do a sales job here." I think this is probably a year or two after you, so they had a bigger team, but it was still less than 100 people. I think it was 50. And he said, "If you want to be an entrepreneur, why don't you start your business now? You just graduated." And I didn't have a good answer to that. And to this day, I still think of that response to the question because no one's ever asked me that before. Anytime I brought up entrepreneurship before, but yeah, no, your story is really interesting because it was quite unique in how you got your role, how you got your job, and kind of went from there. One thing I would ask though is that working for free, I know it benefited you quite a bit, but now there's always talks of, should that not be allowed, but is that a good idea? Is that a bad idea? I know it's kind of moving away from it. In your opinion, if you would go back, do you think that was a smart choice? Do you think you would have asked for a salary? Kind of what was your opinions of that now?
Yeah, I think there's circumstances in which it makes or doesn't make sense,
Mm-hmm,
and the only circumstances where it makes sense is when the employee or candidate is approaching the employer.
mm-hmm,
In the I still think it is the employer's responsibility to set expectations clearly and not just say, sure, yeah, come work for us for free. I think the reality is nowadays Vidyard would probably reject someone rather
mm-hmm,
than have them work for free,
mm-hmm,
or pay someone if they have that open rec. And I think that's the right thing to do. I do think, though, at a smaller stage company, 10 employees less, if someone's approaching you to do that for a very short period of time for an experiment where both the company and the employee are going to put in effort, it may make sense. So I don't
mm-hmm,
think that there's a hard and fast rule. I think generally it shouldn't be accepted and it shouldn't be
mm-hmm,
applied. But I think there's some circumstances where it may make sense. But I think as companies get larger, it's incumbent on them to be more diligent about making sure that they're following best practices and not taking advantage or exploiting, especially younger people in their career. But my
mm-hmm,
philosophy generally has always been learn in your 20s, earn in your 30s,
mm-hmm,
right? And it's funny because they're not mutually exclusive. You don't have
mm-hmm,
to choose one or the other. But I think the intent and the impetus for why people
mm-hmm,
believe in that is if you have to choose between one or the other, a great learning opportunity versus a great earning opportunity, you should certainly at least consider between the two
mm-hmm,
and potentially prioritize the learning one over the earning one. But I also say that coming from a place of being
mm-hmm,
privileged in that I grew up in a middle class family where I didn't have to worry about like, are my parents going to be able to afford groceries or can I go to
mm-hmm,
university? So it's easy for me to go to a job and say I'll work for free,
mm-hmm,
right? Um, so I understand that, and I understand the whole concept of where it comes from. But generally speaking, that aside, if you're somebody who's evaluating between two opportunities and you have the means,
mm-hmm,
then I would prioritize aspects of learning over earning at a
mm-hmm.
younger age.
And I would completely agree. I know it's always hard, especially being a new grad, when you're comparing two salaries and having a $5,000 difference can be dramatic. That can be 10, 20%, if not more of the salary a lot of times. But I think what someone once told me is that like after tax, after everything else, it's not 5,000, it's a little bit less. But then, like you said, 10 years from now, when that 10% is dramatically more, it could be hundreds of thousands, or that's very optimistic, but could be multiple more thousands. That's really when that salary becomes more, I don't say more important, but trying to stand out is very important. And I too, I think one of the interesting things was start talking to founders about working for free thing. Cause I think at the time when I was doing it, it was like very hotly debated topic. I
Mm-hmm.
think the big thing was that a lot of organizations were against it, which surprised me because the idea was they couldn't call on you typically and say, hey, we need this work done,
Mm-hmm.
because for the employee, there was no, or what, like you can't fire me really. So I think what you said is the clear expectations and having that mutual agreement is very important. Just so that you know what to expect coming out of it. So it's mutually beneficial. So you start working for other people, kind of doing a lot of different things along the way. When did you decide, you know what, I want to, I don't say take the risk, but try to do something on my own and start your own organization or do your own thing? Was it since a kid were you selling candy bars out of your locker and this was just the next big thing? Or was it, hey, I have a great idea, I want to drop everything and do it? Kind of how did you transition from being a salary man, I guess people would say, to a entrepreneur, or how did that journey work?
Yeah, I feel like a lot of people will just answer that question with, I've always been this way, or I've always felt this way, or I always wanted to do this way. And I think that there's a lot more considerations and variables that go into this equation. Um, and I'm just thinking through some of the conversations I've had with some of the people that inspire me or mentors. But there's one conversation in particular that I had with a gentleman named Andre Charoux, who's Canadian, lives out in the Valley, started Maple VC. Um, Respect him a ton. I love the guy. And he worked at Hired. He recruited me, and like I got hired at Hired because of him. And I owe a lot of what I do today to just his advice and guidance. And I would say that he gave me the best piece of advice, which is like starting a company. Like you don't have to start a company to learn. Starting a company is not all that it's made out to be. You can learn at a startup. You can grow exponentially at a startup, and you can do a lot at a startup. And I think being younger, you're very impressionable, and startups are, you always see the positive sign and positive story and whatever media outlets report and so on and so forth, and you never realize what you learn or see from, or the news sites you take in. But that feedback really stuck with me, and it stuck with me because he left Uber um, in the top 25 employee, is one of the top 25 employee. We're talking about tens of millions of dollars in equity, not like a couple $1,000,000. We're talking about like retirement money. And he left at month 10 before any stocks vested to go start his own company. And I don't think there's anyone in the world, literally in the world, who had been so close to having orders of magnitude exit better than the majority of the world and not gotten there. And I mean, this is nothing that he wouldn't agree on, right? And so if there's anyone more qualified to give that piece of advice, it would be Andre. And so I really took that to heart, and I really started to think like, what are the best opportunities that I can learn from, things that I could do? And it actually ended up being the reason why I stayed at Hired longer than I did. Um, but I was able to scratch the itch in other ways. And so SalesTO was one of those ways. SalesTO gave me an avenue to start something and test the waters and learn about what that's like. Making money, spending money, time allocation, and all that type of stuff. And so one of the pieces of feedback that I give to other people is like, you don't have to start a company to start something. Um, Build a Shopify site nowadays, right? Um, Go on some of these other sites, whether it's like Upwork or some of these other marketplaces where you could get exposure and do something. I had a friend who developed Raptor swag back in the early 2000s, right? Like before Shopify was a thing, and he did it on WordPress. So I think there's a lot of opportunities to start things. And um, anyways, in SalesTO is when I really got excited and got more confident in my capability to just figure things out. I didn't have the answers to most things, but I was like, I realized that just because I didn't have the answers doesn't mean I couldn't be successful. And so SalesTO, I was literally guessing every single event, every single day, what I need to do next, and just pushing the ball forward. And I realized like I enjoyed that; it excited me, um, and so that was probably one of the initial signs that like I felt more comfortable in those shoes. But the reality is, when I started Kicksaw, I was doing freelancing prior to starting the organization, and so I was generating revenue. In fact, I was generating a lot more revenue than most people make full time as a freelancer. And so I felt very comfortable to start something. I wasn't coming from a place where, the time was um, ticking down. I had the available means to start something. So it's a little bit of a false, at least my story, a false positive in that, like, yeah, I took the leap of faith and I started something. I took the leap of faith while making an above average income freelancing to start a company. Um, and so it wasn't as if like I had to raise money or make this huge um, um, change in my quality of life. So I always like to preface that whenever I tell the story, because some people actually go through that. Some people actually like don't pay. Listen, I didn't pay myself a salary for a while with Kicksaw, right? I'm not going to lie, but at the same time, I wasn't starving. And so, despite being very risky in some of the things that I do, I'm also very risk averse. I have a budget. I manage my spend. I have an allocation that I have to save every single month, and so I'm actually not that risky. Um, And so I wouldn't have been able to start the company had I not had some sort of income coming in. And so it worked out well. I took the chance, and put my time and the
Mhm.
most expensive resource that I had in it. But I didn't kind of start from zero
Mhm.
to build the company up. I was in a very fortunate position.
And I like your story, and I've actually never heard it before, so it's kind of refreshing to hear as well. Is that I think a lot of times, like you were saying, the startup scene could be very glorified because it's the idea of like you have to give up everything, you have to go through that almost like that starving artist to be successful. I mean, and for some people, it is that story where you take a risk on everything and things, great things happen, or sometimes not so great things happen. You don't tend to hear the other side too much. But a lot of times, I always find it funny every time you talk. A lot of times you can talk to people who maybe are in their 40s or 50s worth a lot of money, and you say, oh, you have your own company. How did it start? And they were like, well, I was working at one company, and then me and the other employees, we were working part-time doing this. And like the journey was like, oh, you never, I think I wouldn't say they never created something, but it was a very much a slower transition, or they were working at a job and then doing something on the side. The side hustle became a full-time business, and then they transitioned. So there was never, obviously there's always a risk leaving a job, but it was never that dramatic, like, oh, I have to put all my
Mhm.
effort towards something. There's a lot of hours in the day you can divvy up how you want. But what's really funny, you talk about Uber. This is one of those rare stories. So when I was in Laurier as well, I wanted to work for a company that was coming to Canada, and Uber had yet to come to Canada. So I was emailing them. I don't know how big they were. I think I saw Uber right when they were pitching at like a movie fair or something. So they were like, I don't know who was there. Could have been a few of their founding team members at the time. And I remember talking to them, and I'm like, yeah, like I'm in Canada. And I sent them an email. And they're like, we're not hiring yet. Where I think they were below 50 employees still. And I'm like, yeah, I'm really interested in working in Canada. Like, give me your information. So I went back and forth with them. And then it went cold. I forgot about them and started working for other startups. And to this day, I still have that email in my inbox when I was like, I really should have pushed harder. No idea what Uber would have become, but it
Of
was just
course.
funny how that's always those stories where you're like, oh, not what if, but it's just funny how you can have those conversations around your life. You never know kind of what we made out of them. One thing you touched on, which I don't hear a lot of people talk about, is if you're out of school, a lot of times you have like a not choice, but you sometimes have a choice between working for a big company and working for a startup. And I'm in my belief is that working for a ton of startups and a few big companies along the way is that a lot of times a big company could be a better opportunity to learn than going to a startup, in my opinion. Because, for example, I think, and you could agree or disagree, and we can talk after about it, was that if you work for a startup, a lot of it's up to you and on the founders kind of having the right direction. And if you're young, you might not know that, you can work for a company, learn all these sales techniques that you have to teach yourself, which sounds great, but very hard to do a lot of the times. Where in a larger company, they might have a formula to help you get there. And then after a few years, you could leave and have that knowledge. Um, do you think that, and you kind of touched on this also, do you think that working for startups right out of school when you have no experience is over glorified? Or do you think it's like similar to university? It's what you really make out of it. And any opportunity can be a good opportunity.
Yeah, I have two thoughts regarding that. Firstly, will be a little bit of a story,
Mhm,
but when I was in SDR at Vidyard,
mhm,
um, I started to close deals,
mhm,
which is not typical of an SDR, right?
mhm,
SDR converts the deal, hands the deal off to an
mhm,
account executive. The account executive closes the deal. And I was like, you know what? No one is watching what I'm doing. No one cares too much what I'm doing, to be
mhm,
honest. It was an entry level role,
mhm,
right? There's other things, other fish to fry. And so I just started like converting the opportunity in scheduling the demo call and doing the demos. And
mhm,
a couple people were like, sure, I'll buy a couple seats. And I started to send them a contract that I got from
mhm,
another account executive, and they started to sign it. And then I would just forward the details, just like everyone else, to
mhm,
the CFO. And I remember um, being told, like, you can't do that. You're an SDR, and not listening and just continuing to close deals. And eventually I got promoted to an AE
mhm,
significantly quicker
mhm,
than I would have had I just sat back. And
mhm,
so I think a lot of people look and um, do what's expected of them and not more. And I think that's wrong. I think
mhm,
um, there's a lot of talk about anticipate what your manager wants and do what your manager. Sure,
mhm,
fine, but like, what are you passionate about? What do you want to do? What are you interested in exploring? And go do it.
Mhm.
And once again, maybe I'm talking out of privilege here, but I was at an early stage startup that had no process, and I just did what felt right. And it
Mhm.
had minimal impact on the organization. And in fact, it was probably a positive outcome because the reps weren't working on these small deals that no one cared about. And I got the experience to test the waters on
Mhm.
clients who were potentially kicking tires.
Mhm.
So it worked out extremely well for me and the organization. And I ended up getting
Mhm.
promoted as a result of
Mhm.
showing that I can actually sell. So I think, my first piece of advice to people is like, stop caring too much about what's on your
Mhm.
JD, because most JDs are just whipped
Mhm.
up job descriptions. Stop
Yep.
caring too much about what you think people are expected of you. Do what is expected of you, and then do more that you're passionate about.
Mhm.
And then my second piece of advice would be, a lot of people focus on, well, what do I want to do? What do I want to be in
Mhm.
5 years? Well, what do you not want to do? I keep a track of what I don't want to do, a list of things that I never want to do again. And that helps inform the decisions by making sure that I'm never doing those things again.
Mhm.
Because I'm okay to learn something new. I'm okay to go in uncharted waters and figure stuff out. But there's certain things that I'm just like not interested in. And that if someone asks me to do them, I will gladly say no and make sure that I never do that task again. And that
Mhm.
helps inform my decisions because I'm always going to be interested in learning and trying new things.
Mhm.
And that will help determine the path that I want to go down. So I would also consider like, focus on the things you don't want to learn, not the things, or you don't want to do, not the things that you do want to do, because it's too wide. You'll never figure it out. There's going to be things that you're
Mhm.
passionate about, but I have a belief that people are passionate about things that they're good at. You don't know if you're good at something unless you try it and do it and repeat
Mhm.
and practice it. So passion is developed. I don't think passion is like this nature that you're born with.
Mhm.
It's nurtured over time. In terms of evaluating jobs, to your point, I care less about the size of the company. I care more
Mhm.
about the direct manager. I think the direct manager has more of an impact on someone's growth potential at a young age than
Mhm.
anything else. The company, the industry, the role itself. If you have the
Mhm.
right person who's going to help facilitate your learning and coach you and guide you and mentor you and introduce you to people, you will be a lot more successful than the specific company you're at.
Mhm.
Because I know a lot of people that have gone to startups and it was a wasted effort and it was a bad manager and they hated it.
Mhm.
And I know a lot of people that have had the same experience at a larger company. So focus
Mhm.
on things you don't want to do and make sure that's not included in the role. And
Mhm.
focus on who your direct manager is. That'll have the
Mhm.
most impact on your learning potential, your exposure, your growth opportunities. And then from there, you can evaluate whether it's a big or small company. But I don't,
Mhm.
frankly, I think that's prioritized a little bit too much,
Mhm.
and people are missing the trees from the forest type thing, the forest from
And
the trees.
mhm. No, and I agree with you a lot. I've been with large companies that felt small, small companies that felt large, and any company you work for, you're mostly only talking to a few people. So even if you're on the most exciting, like I know people who work for Google who hated the opportunity and didn't feel that they learned nothing because they were in a team that was a small side team, but they just thought, I mean, help them get other jobs because of the name. But at the end of the day, they felt
Sure.
it was a wasted time. And I think you're right. It's who are you communicating with? What can you actually learn? And what you say, focus on what you don't focus on doing what you don't like, but know what you don't like is probably the best advice I've ever heard. Because when someone says, "What do you like?" and you'll say something, a year from now, it probably will change, like music or other things. But it's a very rare I'll meet someone who says like, "Oh, I very much dislike this," and then 3 years later they'd be like, "Oh, I love this now." Unless it's like a food like broccoli, because as a child everyone was told they hate broccoli, and now everyone's like, broccoli's actually not that bad. So are Brussels sprouts. But typically for like work or other tasks in your life, that's pretty consistent. Your dislikes are tend to be more consistent than your likes, I would say, at least. So sales to unique thing, and I think like how you said, it was you don't have to start a business to start something. And I do think having that is a good idea for a lot of people who are like, look, I want to be an expert in something or want to grow in something. You don't have to necessarily start a business in it, but just trying to become a subject matter expert, or at least have a voice in it is very important. But one thing which is interesting with Kicksaw is that it's pretty technical, your organization, especially working with integration. And how'd you get into that whole Salesforce ecosystem world? Because it's not, from my understanding, I know a few people who've done it. It's not like, oh, I'm going to take a free course online and learn it. It's very complex, very technical. And I mean, organizations pay a lot of money to get it implemented and figured out. How'd you get into that world where you just used to using Salesforce a lot and became an expert, or was it a passion? Were you into the CRM management softwares as a hobby, or how did that kind of happen?
I vividly remember at Vidyard, there was no Salesforce admin, just like any
Mhm.
small startup.
Mhm.
It's kind of owned by a few people, and they actually hired a few people from Salesforce, so they know about Salesforce and they understand it a little bit more intimately than
Mhm.
standard AE who's never touched
Mhm.
or worked in the back end of Salesforce. And I always find myself like running towards difficult or complex challenges,
Mhm.
things that are tough. And Salesforce was just tough. Like everyone at Vidyard struggled with certain aspects. It was always
Mhm.
requiring changes, just like Salesforce is. And that intrigued me because it felt like a challenge to conquer. It felt like
Mhm.
if I knew more about Salesforce than other people, it would make me more desirable and valuable. But also, I would feel like I could help more and add a lot more support to the
Mhm.
organization. And so I just started to get more interested in like, well, what does it take to do these things? And just
Mhm.
reading up online, taking courses, and just practicing in a sandbox environment, a video sandbox environment, asking a bunch of questions. And that was my initial foray, and this was all while I was still an account executive,
Mhm.
into Salesforce. I then moved over to Hired, where I was an account executive.
Mhm.
And once again, there was no one really responsible for owning Salesforce.
Mhm.
And that's when I made a push to be like, you should just make me responsible for it. I had an opinion. I was extremely assertive about my opinion, for right or for wrong. At least I had an opinion.
Mhm.
And seemed to really um, no one seemed to really object to any of my
Mhm.
opinions with respect to Salesforce. They seemed interested. They didn't know if it was right or wrong, and so they couldn't necessarily object. But to me, that felt like acceptance to some of my
Yeah.
ideas. So I really pushed to move into that sales ops role. Mind
Mhm.
you, I had no formal Salesforce experience, zero. While I had an opinion on it, I had
Mhm.
no idea how to implement any of it. So I was
Mhm.
way over my head.
Mhm.
But I put on my confident face and I felt like I could do it.
Mhm.
So eventually I got promoted into the sales ops role, which was like I had no business being there. I ended up convincing the team that if I were to be in that role, I should go to a course. And so they paid for me to go to like $4,000 to a Salesforce course for a week long, where I got a crash course into everything.
Mhm.
And then on top of that, I still ended up hiring a consulting firm to help build everything out because I still couldn't build anything out. And
Mhm.
so I learned a lot in that 8 month period working with that consulting firm, basically being kind of like my personal Salesforce experts. I could ask any questions
Mhm.
to any time of day, and they'd give me the answer, and I'd sit and watch the screen and learn. And so I picked up on a lot of things. And so that's where I got to learn a lot about Salesforce. But even then, I would argue that I was probably at best a junior or intermediate admin.
Mhm.
And so when I started freelancing with Kyle, who's now my co-founder,
Mhm.
he was the one who had kind of sourced a lot of clients, and I kind of joined him freelancing.
Mhm.
I communicated that's what I wanted to do. And Kyle was like, all right, go do it. And literally, I would get tossed some clients who had requests, and there was no one else. It was just me and him. And so
Mhm.
I was doing the work, and I had to figure it out. It was either figure it out or tell the client, I don't know the answer. And you can't really tell the client you don't know the answer because they're paying you to know the answer. And
Yeah.
so I would be spending hours of 9 p.m. to 2 a.m. doing research
Mhm.
and building super simple solutions that would take me 2 hours to build. And I did that 100 times until I got really good at it.
Mhm.
And I learned all through building it myself. I was not that technical. And now I can have deep technical conversations because I've built and seen these things. I can't code, but I can
Mhm.
certainly have conversations about data models and tables and
Mhm.
integrations and how that works. And then I leave the actual execution work up to the developers. But um, I was very fortunate to get the opportunity to do all that work and
Mhm.
learn firsthand how to do it. So it's all from just jumping in and having the confidence to say yes, but not really knowing anything and then learning afterwards.
Mhm. That that's actually, I feel that's a story pretty consistent within your whole life. Kind of taking the initiative, like you said, and then thinking about later being like, oh, they said yes. Now I kind of have to learn it. But what's interesting about you and your story is that it sounds like, at least, it wasn't saying yes because being cocky or overconfident. It was knowing I want this opportunity. I'm willing to work for it. I know I don't know everything, but I'm willing to get to that point. I think that's the big difference that you tend to hear is people who say I can do everything and then agree to it, but then forget to take the steps of actually learning or spending the time in the process, kind of being like, oh no, I have to humble myself and learn. And I think anything when you're working with clients, you get humbled very quickly. It's very rare a client will be like, you know what, you don't know it, it's fine. We just gave you
Exactly.
hundreds or thousands of dollars. you're young, figure it out. That doesn't happen. And I think that's why I also recommend to a lot of people who don't know what to do with their career or life, like getting into a sales role is very transferable to everything. Because if you can know to speak about a product or speak to a client, most jobs have some connection to that. But so, your team of two really, kind of taking off, growing now. Have you found kind of managing a bigger and bigger team? Have there been things that you've had to give up that you wanted to keep doing? 'Cause I know a lot of times you speak to founders is whether it be they really enjoy an aspect, but as the team grows, they can't do it anymore. Have you found that, or have you found that like any other job that now that you've grown into it, you've had to transition to learning new things you never thought you would like, but now you kind of enjoy a bit more?
Yeah, I love what I do. I learn something new every single day, and I feel like we have literally the best team on the planet.
Mhm,
Are there days where I'm like, why don't I just go back to doing consulting? I can consult myself. I'll find 5 clients, and that's it. And like, I'll know the answers to all their questions, and I'll be able to
mhm,
do all the work. Like, that's
mhm,
just an easier solution where I clock in at 9 and clock out at 5, and
mhm,
I know I can do a killer job, and I can, go on with my days. Um, but it's really true when you get to work with amazing people, see people develop,
mhm,
and support the team and grow into a flourishing business. I never appreciated that. I never had the opportunity to do it. And now to see it come to fruition and to see people develop and to see people who, out of their own volition will say like, I love where I work. I want to work
mhm,
here forever, right? Or I
mhm,
feel like I'm learning a lot or I'm getting a ton of exposure. And it's not like we had this crazy plan to develop that. It's our beliefs. It's how we want to
mhm,
run a company. And it's so cool to see that it has such a positive impact on people.
mhm,
It's honestly, it makes me feel like you're high from it. And I
mhm,
want to do it 100 times more, 100 times bigger. So that
mhm,
to me has been extremely fun and rewarding. Is it hard? Absolutely. It's the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. No question
mhm,
about it. Dealing with people, tough situations. I'm a person too. It weighs on me.
mhm,
It's super tough. I can't just like give someone negative feedback and go on with my day. Even constructive feedback, I have to, be conscious about how I'm communicating and making sure that
mhm,
I'm doing so in a very objective manner and not emotionally. And like, I want people to feel like the feedback that we provide is not intended to be a means to put someone down, but to identify opportunities for them to improve and give them the opportunity to improve
mhm,
and then support that. But that's hard to do. Even just giving people the ability to develop relationships, it's hard to do. People say it all the time, but it's really hard because it's people. And
mhm,
so that's where I spend the majority of my time nowadays. And if I could take it back, I wouldn't.
mhm,
I wouldn't take it back. I'm too interested in seeing what the next stage is. And, you know, our secret plan is to just take over consulting. I'm,
mhm.
I'm too confident that every other consulting firm is just stuck in the past and someone's got to bring the world to the future with respect to consulting specifically as it pertains to Salesforce. So I think we're on the right path.
I love sure. And your growth's been, I mean, quite rapid over the past few years, and it really goes to show what you're doing is making a difference and getting people interested. Taking a little bit of an aside, I see there's a Peloton bike behind you.
Oh yeah.
A lot of people I speak to, like, which always comes up, and they always see, like, they talk about their business, but they also talk about a lot of the things they do in their life to help them do better within business. A lot of time I found journaling very common between people who you never think journal. They say, I write, have a book, write all my ideas, or write my goals for the day. From a heavy metal start, someone baking cakes, everyone does that. Or fitness tends to be an important thing. Do you find over your career that there were things you did outside of work that helped you do better at your work?
Absolutely. I am something that stuck with me that I got from a mentor of mine was just how to think about managing your time. And the way it was described to me was your life can be represented as like four stove burners,
Mhm,
four stove tops. And you can have one stove top 100%.
mhm,
You can have two stove tops at like 60, 70%.
mhm,
You can have three stove tops at like 20%,
mhm,
but you can't have all four at once.
mhm,
And those four stove tops represent work, family, friends, and health. Those are the
mhm,
four things. And so you're going to have to compromise in certain areas. You just can't be great at all those things. And I think more important than anything is knowing, how do you want to structure your life? You don't whatever you set is not irreversible. You go through different phases as you're younger.
Mm-hmm.
You might prioritize friends throughout
Mm-hmm.
college and university over family, right? You just spend more
Mm-hmm.
time with your friends. You don't see your family as much. As you get older, you might prioritize your family over your friends
Mm-hmm.
and start a family, and your parents that get older, whatever. And so I think every so often I like to reflect and say, well, where am I? What do I want to be focusing my time on? And which burners do I want to intentionally turn off, and which burners do I want to intentionally turn on? And it can be as simple as that. But I think you have to understand the implications of your decisions and know that, like, you can't successfully have all four on, and you can't successfully even do three very well. You can do two very well,
Mm-hmm.
and the third one might you might compromise a little bit, and the fourth one you're going to neglect entirely. So you just have to be honest
Mm-hmm.
with yourself and understand it. I think fitness has been one of those things that's come and gone in my life, where
Mm-hmm.
there's been areas where I've prioritized it significantly, and then other areas where I deprioritize it. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but I've learned over the years that deprioritizing it um, is in direct correlation with, like, just failing in other areas of life, or being
Yeah.
unsatisfied with other areas of life. And so trying to make time for it earlier in the mornings before I get to work, on the weekends, and prioritizing it has just been a big function for me, and Peloton specifically has helped with
Mm-hmm.
that. So it's one of those burners that I like to keep on, but can't
Mm-hmm.
always keep fully on,
Mm-hmm.
or at least there's certain times in my life where I can keep on.
Mm-hmm.
But family, work are two important things at the moment right now.
Mm-hmm.
And then friends, it's tough, right? You go from working all day, and then you go to spending time with your family. Where in there do you get friends? And so you have to
Mm-hmm.
make time for it, or you neglect it for a little bit, right? And then hopefully work dies down a little bit, and you can pick up on your friends.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think fitness has been a huge thing in my life. And then being conscious of taking time away and taking time off. I'm not great at it, but I'm learning
Mm-hmm.
to do more of it. And it's okay to not be busy. It's okay not to be reading a book or journaling or doing
Mm-hmm.
fitness or listening to a podcast all the time. Like, it's
Mm-hmm.
okay to just go on a walk the dog, to go out and get
Mm-hmm.
ice cream, to go on a
Mm-hmm.
hike. These things, it's okay to just do those things. So it's something that I'm learning and struggling with.
And what you touched on is kind of very interesting. I think one of the hardest things for me in life, and it sounds very weird, but I'm a very adamant about this, is learning how to relax aggressively. And by that, I mean, is a lot of times when I used to be like, okay, I'm taking my mind off something, I'm going to have some downtime. It was never good downtime. It was like I'm watching TV or I'm playing a video game. For some people, that relaxed them, but for me, it kept me high. I guess say high strung or very tense. Where like I know if I go for a walk, which is like shutting off everything, just disconnecting, I will be 10 times better tomorrow. I'll be able to focus better and do everything. But in my head, I'm like, well, if I stare at my computer for an extra 2 hours, I've worked 2 hours more. But I really haven't. I was just staring at the same screen. And I think the hardest thing for me to learn throughout my career was that no no one really cares how many hours you spend on something. At the end of the day, it's really the results from it. So if there's a better combination, that you should probably do that. And I think realizing, I mean, working for a mental health company now, but in general, is that it's very hard to eat unhealthy, have bad sleep, not be active, have bad relationships, and then be very great at one thing. Like typically, a lot of things do tie in together. And I found out, I was looking back, I'm like, well, I used to work out or at least go for walks, which is like 10 minutes. I'm not saying like 3 hour workout, doing CrossFit games, but just going for the walk, I tend to be happier. And most of the days, 10 minutes I was on my phone. So I'm like, oh, I have time. I just think I'm busy, not really segmenting it. And that's why it's called like aggressive relaxing, where like you step away and do nothing and then you can recharge quicker. Weird way of saying it, but I found it a lot of successful people I kept talking to were like very good or were conscious of when I'm off, and when I'm on, I'm on. There's one guy when I went to undergrad, I say he partied the hardest, but also studied the hardest I've ever seen in my life. He like I was always like, I'm studying, I'm doing good with my life, I'm studying, but I guess I wasn't studying too great half the time. But he like party, go to bed at 3 a.m., wake up at 6 a.m., go for a run and start studying all day, but could turn it on and off. I could never do that. So I was conscious of having to spend more time transitioning, but very interesting for sure to say. I like that four burner analogy. Um, you know, your story's quite interesting. If someone wanted to follow you or kind of get involved, or even connect in regards to Sales Toronto, what's the best way of following your journey or even your story in general?
Yeah, I'm occasionally on Twitter. Tend to be on LinkedIn more. I'm not a big social guy, so you won't see me post significantly or very vocal on some of those platforms. I honestly look at them only a couple times a day at best, and most of them are after hours. I try to make an effort not to focus too much on that. Um, but certainly follow along on Kicksaw is where I spend my energy now. And if we're promoting something or if I'm working on something, it'll come out through Kicksaw. But I'm active on LinkedIn or Twitter from like an engagement or interactivity standpoint. And outside of that, I try not to be too visible on social media, just because I don't have the capacity to be that visible on it. I could probably get better at it. It's something that I should focus on, but it's just not something that I prioritize at the moment. So those are the best two places I imagine, like most.
Oh, for sure. And it's great. It's wild how much social media is a skill, but also time consuming thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I've tried to learn a bit of that with the podcast as well. And I realized I'm not that great at it. So just learning what you're good at and what you're not good at. But thank you so much for connecting. And yeah, I'm excited to see your journey and kind of how Kicksaw kind of progresses in your journey in general. I mean, you have quite a unique or refreshing view. I think on the whole startup world and ecosystem. And I think it's nice to see some other perspectives when typically what you hear in the news is very extreme and a lot of times unrealistic because you don't hear the real story behind the making of an organization.